All right, so this is the interactive portion. You can hear me okay when I stand here? Fantastic. I have this really bad habit of wandering when I give a presentation, and Brian saw fit to keep us at the podium, so I may get a little bit twitchy. I'm sure Cooper's happy about that. Actually, just to point out, Cooper is doing a recording of all the talks today, so if you give him a round of applause, that would be fantastic. He's doing a great job. So, first and foremost, thank you for having me here today. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come back. And I really enjoy the opportunity to be able to actually come into the country because currently I'm banned from the United States. Long story for another time. Of all the places in the world that I can get into, the one that I can't is the US, but that's another one. Anyway, so who am I? Real briefly, I have been in this field for longer than I care to admit. I've been doing this for about 25 years. 20 of those years I spent as a defender, so I have done a lot of the same stuff that you're going through today or that you may be coming up to. And it's been a learning experience to say the very, very least. And along that way, I have been able to, my favorite one that I like to talk about is I have a stack of notebooks about yay high because a mentor of mine long time ago said, always write everything down. And he wanted me to carry physical notebooks everywhere I went. I did that. So now, when I write stories for Forbes and other publications like that, I can go back and read these things and wow, I really screwed up there. But there's a lesson to be learned, and I'm able to share that with, obviously, the names and dates being changed to protect the guilty. So I should point out that I am Canadian. Seeing as how they won't let me in the U.S., I have to be very, very clear about that. It's really amazing how things have gotten to this in this geopolitical state today. Just a couple of years ago, I was in the lobby of a hotel in New Delhi, and a lady came up to me. It was a really nice hotel. The lady comes up to me, and she said, "Oh, excuse me, are you an American?" I said, "No, I'm actually from Canada." She goes, "Oh, good." This was probably the most alarming moment I've ever had in my travels, and I've had people point guns at me at different points in my career, but this really actually freaked me out to the point where I actually have a maple leaf now tattooed on my arm because, I'm working for a company that part of what we do is multi-factor authentication. I thought, no, really, I am. It's not a patch on a backpack, but, if you want to see Canadians in their natural state, we're usually dressed up as homicidal maniacs and going across a sheet of ice at a very high rate of speed. So as I was introduced, yes, I do work for Duo, and recently we were purchased by Cisco, and so inevitably the discussion came up as, how are we going to be talking about ourselves? And well, up came Disco, and I have to give full credit to my boss, Wendy Nather, who is here today. Pretend like you know me. So it's really awesome to be able to actually work in this environment, work for somebody like Wendy. But one of the really interesting things about doing that is that I had to call an audible yesterday, and when I realized she's going first, talking about zero trust, and I went, okay, my talk was going to be about zero trust, so I had to pull an audible, and now I'm going to be talking about data breaches today. But really quickly, one of the things that we do at Duo is our mission is to protect your mission. When we talk about zero trust, one of the little euphemisms I like to use is what is love? Because zero trust, when people talk about it, they're like, what does that actually mean? I said, well, what does love mean? It's a different thing for different people. So the idea here is to, better secure your environment, because when you're talking about zero trust, the easiest way to describe it is saying, well, it's all on fire. Now, having been through security in the trenches for 20 years before switching to the vendor side, this is literally how I felt every single day I got to work. And every time I read about another data breach, it was just absolutely maddening. To the point where I realized as I was going through and I started reading data breach notifications for 2016, and I read pretty much every publicly available data breach discovery that I could find, or notice that I could find, if you ever have trouble sleeping. And then I did it again for 2017. And the really interesting thing is there's no common lingua franca between any of these reports. So the idea I had originally was I was going to go through, I was going to do these really nice metrics and everything like that, and I know there's a metrics person over here, but it just wasn't holding together because there was no common lingua franca between them. And as I'm going through these presentations, or rather these disclosures, and it's just absolutely maddening. And I did actually really catch up on my sleep, which I could desperately use right about now. Oh yes, and side note, if anybody follows me on Twitter, this is not the same t-shirt that I wore in Berlin yesterday. I figured that might come up. So when we're going through and talking about data breaches, we have to make sure that we're having a clear and concise conversation as to what we're talking about, and that we're not arbitrarily quoting stuff and not actually understanding what we're dealing with. And when we're looking at these data breaches, we have to understand that they could happen anywhere and any time. Case in point was the sack of Rome in 410 AD, and because this was exported from Keynote, it's a little bit funny, so I apologize for that. But the Visigoths took Rome in 410 AD, and the way they did it is they used their own security controls against them. Sorry, Cooper. They set up around the city, cut off all their access, and after a while, they were able to just throw open the doors and let the attackers in because they had run out of resources. They had expended all of their supplies. This is one of those things where we look at it, we have a hub and spoke type of idea, we have walls with a moat, the whole bit, it didn't work. This was a security paradigm that was proven demonstrably failing in 410 AD. Yet, all through my first 20 years, people were like, oh, we have a firewall, we're fine. And it's like, we have this really interesting way of doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result. And the definition of insanity. But it's really amazing, especially when you look back in 2005, we have here the card systems data breach, and that was about 40 million records. That was huge news at the time. A little later on, in 2009, we had the Heartland data breach. Again, millions upon millions of records. And this was big news yet again. But one of the things I was seeing is that over and over again, these things kept happening. And all of this was here was because apparently it doesn't fit on the screen now. XP command shell was being used on these databases. Now, this is a stored SQL procedure on databases that would allow for remote management of the databases. This is a case of law of unintended consequences coming to bite us in the backside because this was put there for a very real purpose. Unfortunately, when people were exposing their databases to the internet, they were not disabling this particular feature, and a lot of people got hacked in very short order. And it could happen literally to anyone. So I should point out there are going to be some company names that are popping up on this, and this is not a case of shaming anybody. This is literally using these as lessons learned. Case in point here, this was a talk, or rather an article about an S3 bucket. Now, by show of hands, how many people here are familiar with S3 buckets on AWS? Awesome. How many people in here make these publicly available? Thank you for not putting your hands up. Unfortunately, instances like this and other companies that get breached, this is a case where they expose these buckets publicly and people are able to go, and then they say, oh, we were hacked. No, actually you left the front door open. So it's one of those things we have to take into account is that this could literally happen to anybody. Now, as security practitioners, it's incumbent upon us not to shame the people that this happened to. We should have taken the time to teach them what to do. This is one of those things where we have to put the tip of the sword against our chest and lean forward. And when these data breaches happen, we read about them in the news, we're like, oh, that's terrible, and then we flip to the sports page. But the reality is it doesn't really become something that resonates with us until it happens to us. And I've been there, and I'll talk about that. But these data breaches keep happening time and time again, and we really have to understand that data is the new oil. This is the currency of the day. Now, no slide presentation would be complete without a thing about AI. I've had a lot of questions recently about how attackers are going to be using AI to break into your systems. And quite simply, at this point in the game, no, they're not. Why? What's that? You can disagree all day, but yeah, you can buy me gin and tonic. We'll talk about it. Geez, they let the French in here. But this is one of those things where they don't have to do it. I mean, yes, they can. It is available to them. But when we keep making these low-hanging fruit available to the attackers to breach our systems, or doing things like allowing S3 buckets to be publicly accessible, they don't need to go to that extra level. But that level is not only available now, but it has been prophesized for a couple of years. Like this happened, the DARPA Grand Challenge just before DEF CON a couple of years ago, they were setting up for this, and this was absolutely frustrating trying to set up for DEF CON at the same time, trying to step over all these water cooling lines to keep these things going. These are all supercomputers across the stage. The whole idea here was they were to hack into each other. One of these systems that won actually came up with an exploit, or this is my understanding, came up with an exploit that nobody knew about. So these computers were adapting on the fly. Now, fair warning, there's a bit of a flash type thing coming up here, so if you are susceptible to that sort of thing, please look away. But this is one of those things where, yes, this is one example here, but the reality is Krebs is not your, scrolled right off the screen, Krebs is not your IDS. Please understand that Brian Krebs is not your IDS system. So this is an unfortunate case, but Equifax is a great lesson learned, because we're talking about how they got their website exploited and so on and so forth. But the reality is they didn't have to use any sort of exploit in order to accomplish what they were after. In this particular case, they had a web interface with a username of admin and a password of admin that was accessible in 23 different countries with the access to the exact same data. So if we're going to make it this easy for the attackers, they're not going to drop a 0-day. There's no point. So we look at the articles we see about unauthorized access, insider threats, web breaches, and the one thing that really doesn't get a whole lot of discussion points are the missing patches. Now, Owen mentioned that a little bit earlier in his talk, less about when we're looking through the data and we're seeing the breaches that are coming, the attacks that are coming, they're all focused on exploits that were available a couple years ago. Why? Because they work. Now, if no one in this room, or if anyone in this room has not seen the movie Rogue One, spoiler alert, this is one of those movies where I absolutely love it for the simple fact of the matter that this is one of the best data breach movies I've ever seen in my life. So at one point in the movie, just a show of hands, how many have actually seen this movie? Awesome. Okay, this will actually work. I said this in one country where I had one hand go up and I was like, oh, I'm in trouble now. So they had the firewall him in. He's marshalling access, and then somebody shows up with their spaceship and he says, well, hold on a second. You're not supposed to be here right now. And we're like, oh, we kind of got redirected. So they walk through and they're like, oh, we're okay. We're just a little bit late. We got redirected. And they're like, all right, we'll send your code. So, there's the SQL injection into the system. And they're like, yeah, the code checks out. Okay, come on in. So once they're in, then they work to escalate their privilege. And then they're on the base for a little bit of the time before they start seeing the indicators of compromise popping up all around them. And the best part is when this gentleman turns around, looks to his staff, and goes, ah! They didn't know what to do. They were absolutely frozen in place. And having gone through a few incidents over my career, there were times where we literally stare at the screen going, what? And then it kicks in. That adrenaline gets going. But by the point that we see these indicators of compromise popping up, by that point, it's a little bit too late. They're in there, they got what they're after. Or worse still, the egress filtering has already begun. And there goes the data. So, what is the one lesson from this particular data breach that they don't really talk about and we should actually have a better conversation about? Any ideas? Say again? No, that's another talk, but stay tuned. They didn't encrypt their data. So they were able to gain access to this data, upload it to various spaceships around the planet, and it was freely accessible. Now, this is tongue-in-cheek, of course, but these data breaches have been going on for so long. This is on my own website. I started tracking this back in 2012. And these were various different sites. One particular, like LinkedIn, was 6.5 million records. At that time, that was huge news. Now we're talking about orders of magnitude of billions of records being compromised. And this really goes back to, we have to devalue credentials. We have to take away that value that the attackers see. Because the attackers, there is a monetary value to your usernames and passwords on the web. They can sell them. If we're able to devalue that, remove that, and make it something like, multi-factor authentication, that would be a great idea. Because the attackers are going to keep coming until we change the way we do things. And I know what I'm talking about because I have suffered through this. This is an actual defacement page from a company I was working at. We had this marketing website that was set up off to the side, and their campaign had been finished, and unfortunately it was running a deprecated version of WordPress. So we said to them, I said, look, this is a problem. We need to take this offline. They're like, yeah, sure, no problem. We'll take it down for you. The campaign's over anyway. I'm like, great. 2 weeks later, the phone starts ringing when I get into the office. In Canada, it's called CBC, is a major news publication. They were the first one through the door, and I'm like, okay, that can't be good. Followed by basically every other publication in North America and one in Europe. They were really loving the salacious nature of the attack, and I'm sitting there going, wait a minute, this was supposed to be taken offline. Now, whose fault was it? Was it the marketing team or mine? It was actually mine and my team because I had not followed up with them. I took them at their word that they were going to take it down, but I didn't close that loop. So again, there was a case of I had to take that sword tip, put it against my chest, and lean forward. And these attacks are going to keep coming. The best thing about this is that it was only 192 records, and none of these records were existing on any system that was in our enterprise. The bad thing was that from a reputational risk, this was ugly as it gets. So 2 years ago, I did a snapshot from this particular website, which handles all sorts of data breaches, doing data visualization. This is called informationisbeautiful.net. If you ever get a chance to check it out, I really recommend it. I have no affiliation with them whatsoever, but this is pretty cool if you're a data geek. So this was 2 years ago. This is now. I'll step back. This is 2 years ago. This is now. This is why we have to make sure we're paying attention to the way we're doing things, the way we're handling our environments, because it's getting bigger, better, faster, scary. And trust me, it feels like we always want to have a data breach. Is really how it seems to be. I mean, obviously being a tongue-in-cheek, but we got to make sure we have good controls in place, because not every control is like the other one. And bad things are going to happen when we don't do the basics for taking care of our systems. These are snapshots from when WannaCry happened. This was using something that was a known bad for about a decade. We can do better than this. So when you're looking at data breach, you have to look at what are they going to be your costs in the event you get breached. So unfortunately, yeah, that's not too bad. Okay, so you got to look at the cost of the investigation. That's going to take time and money. You're going to have your resources dedicated. That is taking away from other projects that you could be working on. What's the cost of remediating findings? In one company I worked at years ago, we had a pen test done, and we had all these findings. We took them to the IT team, and they said, great, thanks for that, and nothing ever happened. This was a pen test where they actually compromised everything on the network, and I mean everything, but they accepted the risk. In the event you have a horrible data breach where everything gets scorched, what's your cost to recover? Do you have backups? Are you able to recover at all? What are your communication costs? How are you going to handle that communication not only to your board and to your team and staff, but to the public at large? How are you going to marshal that? And legal fees. That's always a fun one. And loss of revenue, potentially, or customer attrition. We haven't seen that too many times, and oddly enough, by and large, when I see a lot of data breaches, they tend to actually, the companies, their stock tends to recover in rather short order, which I've always found very curious. So, the costs can and do happen in this particular case here, when Yahoo was being acquired, they neglected to mention the data breach, and they took a $350 million haircut on the deal as a result of that. Or if you're not encrypting the data, the bad things can happen where, you can get compromised and all of a sudden everything's out in the world. The problem here was that the response was, oh, we don't have to encrypt anything. Nobody told us we had to. This is just not a great practice to get into. So the lesson learned there is encrypt everything. It's a good idea. The two gentlemen that were responsible for this particular attack actually did go to prison just recently. Oh, somebody walked by. All right. So when we look back at Equifax, who got the pink slip? Think about this. If your company got breached, what would be the cost to you and senior management? So the CISO retired. The CIO retired. And the CEO retired. So the really interesting thing is the CISO, who was at this company for 4 years, walked away with $11 million. I am in the wrong field. But this is one of those things, is think about it for a second in the perspective of your organization. If your senior management gone like that, how would you handle it? How would you recover? What kind of plans do you have in place in order to address these sort of things? Because if it can happen to them, it can happen to damn near anybody. And it did. This is one of their competitors the next day. Come on. They were installing Trojan Flash. Great fun. So, in addition to dealing with all those sort of things, with the costs and all the rest of it, you also have to talk about compliance. Now, compliance generally is one of those things where security people go, oh, not them again. But they really are the adult in the room a lot of times. This is one of those type of things where you can align yourself with your compliance team in order to accomplish your goals. Because as frustrating as it might be, they can actually take your battle plans and look at them and vet them and say, look, this is where we found weaknesses and that sort of thing and how you can improve it. And things are going to happen that are inexplicable. So, for example, here, back in the 90s, I was working for a defense contractor in the United States, back when they used to like me. And in this particular case, we were getting attacked regularly by this one IP. Every day I come in and it's like, oh, again with this. They weren't getting anywhere, but one day I didn't sleep well that night, so I went after them. And I broke into their system, and I left a little flag in there, and I said, look, these are the problems. This is why we have a problem with you. These are things you need to fix. And I gave them my burner email address so they can contact me. And I felt all proud of myself, and I went back away, and I was like, all right, have my coffee. Next morning, I got an email. They weren't mad, but they pointed out that I had hit the wrong IP address. So I had got one of the octets wrong. This is one of those cases for hacking back is a really bad idea. So if you get somebody trying to breach you, hitting them back is not a great idea. And it could happen literally to anyone. So at another company I was working on a few years past after that, I had a vendor come in and say, look, we would absolutely love to sell you our product, and we would run a demo of our vulnerability scanner, who will remain nameless, and you can see the results. And I'm like, yeah, sure, here's a Class B. And they went, excuse, what, Class B? And I said, well, we're a power company, and this is how we operate. And I'm like, all right, fine. So they ran a scan of the entire Class B and gave me a report, which is about that thick. And it was so nice of them to print it and courier it to me. But in this report, I start flipping it through, and it's like, okay, Shenzhen, Beijing. Uh-oh. They had got one of the octets wrong and scanned an entire Class B of China's IP space. They have a lot of printers that are hanging out in the breeze there. So these mistakes are going to keep going, and you have to make sure that you handle them well, because things like this are going to happen where you have, in this particular case, I was working at another power company where they came to me with an app that had already gone live, and they said, look, can you do a security review on this? And I was like, well, ideally this should have happened before it went live, but it was live. So I did a view source on the web app, view source right there, and just in case you're not sure, that was what I did in a browser. Can you guess what I found? Commented out in the code was username admin, password admin. I see a theme developing here. The project manager, this was his response. You hacked our application. This was my reaction. Thankfully, this was not my reaction. And I sat down and I had a conversation with him, because one of the things I realized very quickly was I never told them what they should do from a security perspective. That was on me. And that's one of those things. As security professionals, we have to stop blaming the user. We have to make better applications as well. We have to educate. And this is something that we can do. But you got to bear in mind that sometimes you just got to bite your tongue and move on, because things like this are going to happen. One company I was working at, 2 weeks after I left, I got a call from a coworker, and they said, here, put in this URL, which is publicly facing, and at the end of it, /Etsy password. This was something that I had them fix the week before I left, and they went and undid it after I left, because apparently it broke some functionality. No matter what you do, people are going to use tools in ways you never imagined. Or sometimes they'll want tools that do nothing at all. Too soon? And sometimes bad things happen to good people. Unfortunately, this was a case where a data security company had their entire database dumped onto the front page. This was literally about 20 minutes before I gave a similar talk like this a couple years ago. And it was amazing to me, because I felt their pain. As Bob Lord said when he went through that data breach investigation, he said it felt like vertigo. And when I went through the AMD thing, albeit orders of magnitude smaller, but the pain was no less. And bad things are going to happen even when you don't intend them to. Like the Morris worm. That thing got out. It did not go according to plan, because that wasn't the plan. And that's just it. We have to be able to adapt and address these matters as we're going forward. And as security practitioners, we got to stop looking at the world like this. Not everything is a target. We need to learn to communicate better and to work better together, because we don't want to align against ourselves. Another partner we need to look at is talking to internal audit. You want to test your data breach response plan. You want to deal with the risks and benefits of information sharing with them, so you have a partner. Having them and compliance working with you as security professionals is a really good thing, because it'll help you when you go to have the bad news conversation. 0 days are not the thing I worry about the most. I commonly refer to them as 100 days, or whatever you want to call it. Like Owen mentioned in his talk, he was dealing with vulnerabilities from 2 years ago. And that's just it. How many times do we worry about the 0 day? Meanwhile, we've missed the Oracle patch revision from the last 3 years. And the question I often get is, where do we go from here? How do we begin? As you start where you are and work from there. Build out a risk register. What are the problems in your environment? Identify them, catalog them, track them, and put a plan in place as how you're going to address them. Don't just accept the risk, but look at a serious plan of how you're going to go forward fixing these things. And deal with patching. I know this is the ugly redheaded stepchild that nobody ever wants to talk about, but this is something that we can do a better job of. There's no quick fix. This is something we need to do a better job of addressing this because we need to address these threats earlier. We don't want to apply that Oracle patch that from 3 years ago for whatever reason, usually because the DBA is doing, this is mine. But we're constantly being asked to innovate. And we want to make sure that when we're doing this in a safe and secure fashion, and that we're communicating this not only with our internal teams, but all the stakeholders. And otherwise, things like this are going to happen where a hacker 4chan ends up on CNN. So, I'm going to skip, and thank you. And I'm out of time. I don't think I can, or can I? One question, if there's any questions. Oh, the metrics, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so what's your favorite risk metric?
I was desperately trying to think of an answer for you when I was listening to that earlier. My favorite risk metric is how many empty coffee cups are on the desk in production. So that way I can actually measure how long that security incident took. I don't have a good answer for you beyond that. Cool. All right. Thank you very much.